Good morning. Julie, if you could be the timekeeper this morning during our PLC, and Wendy, if you could be the facilitator and just make sure that we are staying on topic during our PLC, that'd be great. Today we're going to talk about my signature assessment in EDOL 647. Here's our table of contents. We're going to first have the meeting agenda. Then we'll talk about the PLC project explanation. I'll talk about my personal PLC vision statement. Then we'll discuss the problem, the strategy, the advances and disadvantages of the strategy, two different implementations that I would like to look more into, the data that I collected from those implementations, and then reflections and next steps. Here's our agenda. So first is the PLC project explanation. So this is just kind of what I've been doing over the past few weeks. Part one is the requirements. Step one, I had to identify a problem within my classroom. Step two, I had to select a strategy and intervention to implement. I had to choose an article to study and then reflect in my implementation on that. Step three was I had to plan how the strategy and the article would be used in my classroom. And then part two, step four was write up the intervention. Step five was summarize and analyze the data that I collected during the intervention. And then step six was to reflect on next steps and possible extensions of the learning and the implementations. Here's my personal PLC vision statement. So I wrote that I envision a future where I am successfully advocating for my students and creating an environment that is diverse, differentiated, and accessible for all learners. My vision is to prioritize the health, safety, and uniqueness of each student and make sure that their needs are met so that they can thrive in the classroom. In order to accomplish these classroom goals, I envision a professional learning community that is a collaborative space for sharing and reflection. As a PLC leader, I will take great pride in running PLCs with clear, concise language and advocating for all members and stakeholders. So first I had to identify a problem in my classroom, and we kind of have talked about this in our other PLCs because we've all kind of seen it in our classrooms. So we've talked about lack of engagement, lack of student engagement in our math block, and the rate of success as defined by individual assessment rubrics that we've created together is lower than we had anticipated and desired. So we've been kind of working on that. So the strategy that I selected to implement into our classroom, into our math block specifically, is number talks. So I am starting to implement beginning each math block with a 3 to 7 minute number talk as a math warm-up, kind of as a review and to explore new topics that we're going to discuss and see who kind of gets it and who doesn't yet. The warm-up will include at least one image. Some of the number talks that we have done have been multiple images in like a slideshow format. The number talk will be teacher guided, but the conversation is more student led. We do this on the carpet, so it's more communal. All right, some advantages of implementing number talks is that they are student led, they're quick and easy. There's really no wrong answers because those wrong answers can lead to discovery and can lead to the correct answers. And students also learn verbal communication skills and how to show and prove their thinking or how they got to an answer and kind of discuss with their classmates how it might be different than another person's strategy. Some disadvantages of number talks are that they need consistent and structured routine and that can be difficult to learn in the beginning, difficult to set expectations in the very beginning. Using this strategy also takes up time during the instructional block. We try to keep it to 3 to 7 minutes, but sometimes when the conversation is student-led, you don't have control of how long that lasts exactly. If they're really into the conversation, it might last a little bit longer. But honestly, I could see that as an advantage on the flip side, because if they are taking a longer time to come up with the answers, then they're probably learning those problem-solving skills and strategies, which is what we would want in a math block anyway. So I could see that as a disadvantage and an advantage. And then another disadvantage is that recording student thinking can be challenging because they're all talking, they're talking quickly, and it's kind of hard to keep data on conversation when it's happening with a whole group. Implementation number 1, there's an emphasis on rules and procedures. There was a lot of calling out, so we were kind of learning how to raise our hand. There was good discussion, but my students needed reminded to take turns and to raise their hand. This was expected though. Students were apprehensive about sharing their ideas at first. When a conversation is student-led, they're a little bit more reserved. So I think that will get better with time, but from the first implementation, that's kind of what I saw. One image was shown and students were asked to discuss. So for my first implementation, it was only one image. And this implementation did take longer than expected. It did take 10 minutes, but we were still learning rules and procedures of number talks and discussions in general, whole group discussions. So I do think that it will go down in time a little bit. Here's what I observed from implementation number 2. We still had to have reminders of the rules and procedures, but there was significantly less calling out. We had great discussion and students were able to explain their thinking to their classmates. The students were more comfortable sharing their ideas. I think once they saw that it was okay to have a wrong answer because we would find the correct answer together, they were more willing to share. So I think that goes back to like building classroom culture and collaboration. And instead of just one image, a slideshow of 3 images was shown, and this created more in-depth conversation and discussion about comparing one image to the next, and then comparing those two to even a third one. So I think that really helped keep them engaged, and keep the discussion flowing, which led to a 5-minute number talk. So that's more of our sweet spot. That's our ideal time where we want to be. So I think this implementation really showed growth. So the data collected for the purposes of this research were observations of samples from 3 students in my kindergarten homeroom. I randomly chose 1 student from each of my 3 tiered math groups. Therefore, 1 sample student was considered high achieving, 1 sample student was considered average achieving, and then another sample student was considered underachieving. The assessment used to collect the data was the same 5-question assessment given before any implementation of the intervention and after each implementation of the intervention. So it was given a total of 3 times. The assessment questions were related to the intervention topic. So as you can see here, here's student sample number 1. They started with a score of 3. That was before implementation. After implementation number 1, they stayed steady at a score of 3. After implementation number 2, they scored a 4. And after implementation number 3, which was not discussed in this slideshow, but I did implement it a 3rd time, they actually scored a 5. So they are showing steady but slow growth. Student sample number 2, we started before implementation at a 0. After implementation number 1, the student scored a 2. After implementation number 2, they also scored a 2. And then after implementation number 3, they scored a 2 as well. And then our last student sample, number 3, before implementation, they scored a 3. After implementation number 1, they scored a 4. After implementation number 2, they scored a 5. And after implementation number 3, they scored a 9. Any questions on that? So after I reviewed the data, I did some reflecting, and I thought that implementing number talks in my math block has created a culture of learning and growth. The students are gaining confidence in explaining and defending their answers, and students are building problem-solving skills and broadening their mental toolbox with strategies from their peers. Some possible next steps are number talk warm-ups and wrap-ups. So I thought it could be interesting to implement not only just a number talk before the math block, but then after the math block as well, to kind of wrap up our learning and do a little bit of review. And then another possible next step is to use number talks as a formative assessment once students are used to routines and procedures. So I could kind of use that to collect individual student data and use that as proof of capabilities and knowledge. So that is all I have for you today, and I'm interested to see how you implement number talks in your classroom and what reflection you get from that in our next PLCs.